Doctor Who Season by Season. New Who Series 3 Review. Series 3 of fanfiction New Who aired in 2007. It was the second season to star David Tennant as the 10th Doctor and introduced Freema Agyeman as his new companion, Martha Jones. Of course, before Series 3 was the 2006 Christmas special The Runaway Bride, which guest-starred Catherine Tate as Donna Noble. I actually rather like The Runaway Bride and consider it to be, along with The Christmas Invasion, basically the only New Who Christmas special actually worth watching. It's funny and engaging and genuinely different. But what of Series 3? Series 2 had been a massive success with the general public, though my own reaction to it was markedly different. After being fairly happy with Series 1, I felt decidedly let down by Series 2 and was even decidedly lukewarm on the new Doctor to boot. Nonetheless, I still held hope that Series 2 would prove to be a blip and that things would get better again with Series 3. Remarkably, my prayers were actually answered. Yes, I do indeed actually like Series 3. The season begins with Smith and Jones, which introduces Martha. I'm going to be Mr. Unpopular again by saying that I reckon Martha is by far the best companion of the Tennant era. Tennant himself is also much better playing against her than with any of the others, neither going googly-eyed over her like he does with Rose, nor desperately mugging and hamming it up as if to say, see? I'm funny too, honest. As he so often does opposite Catherine Tate in Series 4. In fact, this is easily the best season for Tennant. He seems far more confident than in Series 2 and is easily the most doctorish in this season, while still being fresh and not going stale and becoming caricatured as started to happen the following season. Nonetheless, I'm not overly keen on Smith and Jones as a season opener. It certainly is miles better than New Earth as a season opener, but then, so is Spectrox Doxymere. It's not terrible and it all looks great but is still a very lightweight and rather silly opener, and I remember on first viewing getting to the last 5 or 10 minutes and starting to look around the room thinking, in true Danny Glover style, that I might be starting to get too old for this shit. Fortunately, things improve with the next episode, the Shakespeare Code. This does not seem to be a particularly popular episode, which I find a tad odd as it's by far the best thing Gareth Roberts has done for the new series. It's not just a bit of fluff for starters, as unlike pretty much everything else he's ever done, it's much more traditional Doctor Who, with plenty of humor but also a degree of menace and an actual story and threat which, along with the exquisite period atmosphere, makes this a very enjoyable romp. Yes, the characterization of Shakespeare is terribly unlikely, but this is definitely a step up from the previous episode and, indeed, most of the previous season. Next up is Gridlock, the third in the so-called New Earth trilogy. Given that the first, The End of the World, was my least favorite episode of Series 1 and the second, New Earth, is one of the worst episodes ever broadcast, you can probably understand that I approached this one with decided trepidation, thinking it would be utter shit. I was wrong. In fact, I was completely wrong and very happily surprised by that fact. I loved Gridlock. It's a terrific episode with beautiful visuals that takes a wonderfully surreal notion, that of the never-ending traffic jam, and plays with it for both humorous and unsettling effect. There is something very McCoy-esque about this episode, which is probably why I like it so, and indeed it is very easy indeed to see Sylv in this episode, jumping into the various cars and doffing his hat at the occupants. Next up is the Daleks in Manhattan two-parter, which most fans seem to loathe but I most certainly do not. In fact, I reckon Daleks in Manhattan is the best Tennant story, probably the best Dalek story of New Who and certainly miles better than any of the Dalek stories we've had since, all of which have been absolute shit on a stick. Daleks in Manhattan absolutely delighted me on first viewing with its bizarre and surreal potpourri of 1930s influences, atmosphere and pop culture, and remains an absolute favorite of mine, as any of you who have seen my underrated stories video on this will already know. I don't propose to go over the same ground twice here, but yeah, this two-parter is another winner, and I was starting to very much warm to this season by this point. Sadly, the next episode lets things down a bit. The Lazarus Experiment is a flat runaround episode that wastes its best asset, Mark Gatiss being entertainingly sleazy as Professor Lazarus, by turning him into a big, stupid, lumbering CGI monster 15 minutes in and then doing nothing but having him chase people in a very unscary manner for the rest of the episode, even resorting to a "he's dead, oh no he isn't" lame-ass twist when the writer realizes the story is over but he's still got another 10 minutes to fill. The laziness of this episode is reinforced by the appalling characterization of the 10th Doctor, who seems to take against the Lazarus machine immediately. Not because he doesn't think it will work or because he knows it will have terrible side effects, but simply because he doesn't like the idea of mankind extending his lifespan. This coming from a man whose species lives hundreds if not thousands of years. What an asshole. This isn't the only time the 10th Doctor is made to look like a total hypocritical prick, but it is one of the most egregious, not least because this clearly isn't down to any real intention on the part of the writer, as it is just sheer fucking lazy writing. Bollocks. Thankfully things pick up again with the next episode, 42, which is strange given that the always unreliable barometer of quality, fan consensus, generally seems to view these two episodes the other way around. It is true that 42 is nothing particularly special and is essentially just another runaround episode itself, but the difference between this and the Lazarus Experiment is that here someone, be it writer Chris Chibnall or director Graham Harper or both, actually thought to put a bit of menace, tension, pace and even genuine horror in this one. 42 is unremarkable but inoffensive and certainly pretty watchable. Next up is the Human Nature two-parter, which Fandom regards as not just the best of the season but one of the best stories ever made. I of course think it's shit. Well made but pompous, boring, stodgy, poorly thought out merchant ivory tedium that makes little sense and is morally despicable to boot, which includes the 10th Doctor. For a full evisceration check out my overrated stories vid, but yeah, to me this is the worst of the season along with Lazarus and a real bore fest. Thankfully the season gets back on track in a big way with the next story, Blink. Blink is of course wildly overrated, but only in the sense that declaring a story that hardly has the Doctor in it as one of the very best Doctor Who stories ever seems a bit balmy, if not unhinged, to me. It's really more of a Twilight Zone episode than a Doctor Who story, but yeah, it is superb, a fantastic piece of television and one of the season highlights. Tennant isn't in it much, but we get Carey Mulligan as our lead instead, and quite frankly she is so mouth-wateringly, staggeringly, impossibly beautiful in this that Tennant could have fucked off and not come back and left her in charge, and I would have been just fine with that. Thank you very much. Next up is the three-part Master Season finale, which I tend to refer to simply as the last of the Time Lords three-parter. Now this is an interesting one. For many classic fans and New Who skeptics, of which I am most definitely one, this seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back and the point where they went from being slightly uncertain and dubious about the modern televised fan fiction version of the series to outright hating it. Just to again prove what a completely contrary bastard I am even within the subsection of Who fandom that is often outright hostile to the new series, I actually really like this story for the most part. Indeed, I outright loved it on first viewing, when I got to see it in full on one night on DVD because we were still months behind on transmission here in New Zealand, and I was like, bugger that, I'll import them from the UK. The days when I actually even cared about watching the new series. Halcyon times. Anyway, I digress, although I've never quite recaptured the exhilaration I got watching this story for the first time on later viewings. I still think it's generally great and easily the best attempt at a real epic that the new series has ever managed. I really like John Sims' Master too, unusually I know for a classic fan. I mean, he's shit in The End of Time, but he's great here, hilariously camp but still maintaining an undertone of genuine evil, insanity and sadism lurking underneath that. The first 2 episodes are pure class. But while I do think it goes a little bit downhill in the last episode, I don't hate it like some do. The Dobby Doctor stuff doesn't really bother me, and I do like the dystopian post-apocalypse tone of the last episode, nor do I really have a problem with the reset button being pushed or the manner in which the Doctor defeats the Master, which is really just turning his own weapon against him in a clever way. The only real thing I don't like is the execution of the Doctor being restored, which is rather cringeworthily done, and then the Doctor blubbing like a big fucking baby over the death of his arch-nemesis, which seems wildly inappropriate and out of character, given the number of times he was happy to condemn him to seemingly certain death in the classic series without so much as raising an eyebrow. But yeah, aside from those couple of things, I really enjoy this story, and it's the only Tennant-era finale I can actually say that about. All in all, I generally really like Series 3 too. It is the best Tennant season by several thousand light years and probably the best of the Davis era as well, with a number of stories that range from good and entertaining and solid to genuine favorites. Series 3 gets a strong B+ from me.